January 17, 1945. The Gothic line, northern Italy. Snow fell in soft curtains across the Apennine ridges, dusting the shattered stone villages that clung to the mountainside like broken teeth. In the valley below, a column of American soldiers moved through the pre-dawn darkness, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. They were the men of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, and they walked with the deliberate stride of those who had been told repeatedly they could not fight, would not fight, should not fight. The Germans watched them through field glasses from fortified positions carved into ancient hillsides, and they smiled. These were the Schwarze Soldaten. The black soldiers the Wehrmacht intelligence briefings had assured them were poorly trained, easily broken, useful only for labor battalions in the rear. The SS officers manning the defensive works along Highway 12 had read the reports. They had heard the stories. They believed what they had been told. They were about to learn otherwise. The Gothic line was Hitler's final defensive barrier in Italy, a 200-mile fortification stretching from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic, anchored in mountain passes that had repelled armies since Roman times. Here, embedded in concrete bunkers and reinforced observation posts, the Wehrmacht and SS divisions had spent months preparing positions designed to bleed any attacking force white. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring himself had proclaimed it impregnable. The Italian campaign had already become a grinding war of attrition, each ridge and valley purchased with Allied blood, each advance measured in yards rather than miles. And now, in the depths of winter, when conventional military wisdom dictated a pause in operations, the 92nd Infantry Division was being asked to do what seasoned white divisions had failed to accomplish: break through the Gothic line and push toward the Po Valley beyond. The men of the 92nd knew what was expected of them. More precisely, they understood what was not expected. They had heard the whispers in the replacement depots, seen the skepticism in the eyes of white officers assigned to their units, felt the institutional doubt that followed them like a shadow from the training camps of Arizona to the embarkation ports and across the Atlantic. This was an army that still segregated its blood supply, that assigned black soldiers to separate units under predominantly white command, that maintained an official policy of racial separation, even as it fought a war against fascism. The 92nd Infantry Division was a proving ground and a political liability, an experiment in racial integration wrapped in the rhetoric of democratic values. For the young men from Chicago and Detroit, from the cotton fields of Mississippi and the tobacco farms of North Carolina, every step forward was weighted with the burden of representation. They were not simply soldiers fighting Germans. They were black soldiers fighting to prove their humanity to an America that had never fully acknowledged it. The SS defenders dug into the mountains above them had no such complications of identity. They were Herren folk, master race, warriors of the Reich, schooled in doctrines of racial supremacy that placed them at the apex of human evolution, and consigned others, Jews, Slavs, Africans, all deemed Untermenschen, to categories of biological inferiority. Nazi racial theory was not merely propaganda, it was the organizing principle of their state, taught in schools, enforced by law, defended with industrial-scale murder. To the German soldiers watching the 92nd advance, these were not worthy opponents. They were curiosities, anomalies, proof of American degeneracy, a mongrel nation so bankrupt of martial virtue it sent its racial inferiors to fight its battles. The Germans expected collapse. They anticipated rout. They prepared for a victory that would validate everything they believed about race and war and the natural order of the world. What they received instead was a lesson in the catastrophic price of ideological blindness. The 92nd Infantry Division had been formed in October 1942, reactivating a unit designation from the First World War, when black soldiers had served with distinction in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. But institutional memory was short and selective in the United States Army of 1942. Despite the documented combat record of the 92nd's predecessor, despite the proven valor of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, who spent 191 days in combat without yielding an inch of ground, military leadership remained convinced that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, initiative, and courage necessary for frontline combat. The prevailing wisdom, articulated in official War Department studies and echoed in officer training manuals, held that African American troops were suitable primarily for labor and service roles. Combat assignments were concessions to political pressure from black newspapers and civil rights organizations, grudging experiments conducted with the expectation of failure. The division trained at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, a remote desert post where segregation was enforced with the same rigor applied to military discipline. The men drilled in summer heat that turned the parade ground into a furnace, ran obstacle courses in full gear, practiced night maneuvers in terrain that offered no mercy to the unprepared. They were molded into infantrymen through the same grueling regimen imposed on white divisions, yet they carried an additional burden. The knowledge that their performance would be scrutinized not as individuals, but as representatives of their race. Every mistake was magnified, every success discounted. When the division shipped overseas in the summer of 1944, they arrived in Italy as a unit already marked by doubt, commanded by officers who ranged from cautiously supportive to openly contemptuous, inserted into a theatre where their reputation had preceded them. The Italian campaign was a meat grinder. The terrain favoured defence, each mountain ridge offering observation and fields of fire that made frontal assault suicidal. The Germans had learned the lessons of defensive warfare through bitter experience on the Eastern Front, and they applied that knowledge with brutal efficiency in Italy. Allied casualties mounted through the summer and fall of 1944 as American, British and Canadian divisions battered themselves against prepared positions. Progress was measured in blood and exhaustion, and into this crucible came the 92nd Infantry Division, assigned to the western sector of the line where the Apennines rose in steep, forested ridges that channeled movement and made concealment nearly impossible. Their first major engagement came in late 1944 during operations around the Serchio River Valley. The division attacked across difficult terrain against dug-in German positions, and the results were mixed. Some units advanced with determination and skill, others faltered under intense fire. The performance was typical of green troops encountering combat for the first time, uneven, costly, marked by the mistakes of inexperience. But when white divisions stumbled in their initial engagements, it was attributed to the fog of war, to the strength of German defences, to the challenges of terrain and weather. When the 92nd Infantry Division faced setbacks, it became evidence of racial inferiority. Reports filtered back through command channels that confirmed existing prejudices. The narrative calcified. Black soldiers could not fight effectively. The 92nd was a failed experiment. None of this was communicated to the men of the division, who knew only that they were expected to attack, to hold ground gained, to prove their worth through the only currency that mattered in combat, blood and persistence. They did not have the luxury of excuses. They could not afford the margin of error granted to white units. Every hill they took had to be taken perfectly. Every defensive line they held had to be held without question. The burden was crushing and unfair, and they carried it forward into the winter of 1945. The Gothic Line offensive began in earnest after the New Year, when strategic planners in Allied headquarters decided that continued pressure was necessary to prevent German reinforcement of the Western Front, where the Wehrmacht had just launched its desperate Ardennes offensive. The 92nd Infantry Division received orders to advance north along Highway 12, clearing German positions in the mountains west of Lucca, seizing key terrain features that would open routes toward the Po Valley. It was a mission no one expected them to accomplish. The Germans expected to hold. Allied command expected costly, limited gains. The men of the 92nd expected to fight. because that was what they had come to do. They advanced in the darkness before dawn on January 17th, companies moving in column through terrain where a single machine gun nest could pin down a battalion. The German defenders opened fire at first light, mortars and artillery bracketing the approach routes, small arms fire raking the slopes. The Americans took casualties and kept moving. They flanked positions that could not be taken by frontal assault. They called in artillery strikes on bunkers too strong to reduce with infantry weapons. They fought with the tactical competence of trained soldiers and the determination of men who understood that failure was not a personal defeat but a racial verdict. The SS troops manning the defensive positions fought back with the confidence of men who believed themselves superior. They had held these mountains for months. They knew every field of fire, every avenue of approach, every position from which to deliver enfilade fire. They had withstood attacks by battle-hardened British divisions and veteran American units. These black soldiers, they assured themselves, would break like the others. They would falter under fire, lose cohesion, retreat into the valleys below. It was inevitable. It was natural law. But the Buffalo soldiers did not break. They came forward in fire teams, using cover and concealment, suppressing enemy positions while maneuver elements flanked strong points. They adapted to terrain, modified tactics in real time, demonstrated the kind of small unit initiative that military theorists insisted required qualities they supposedly lacked. When officers fell, sergeants took command. When sergeants fell, corporals stepped forward. The chain of leadership held not because of the quality of white officers imposed on them, but because of the NCO corps they had developed among themselves. Men like Sergeant Edward Carter, Jr., who would later earn the Medal of Honor for single-handedly destroying enemy positions, despite multiple wounds. Men whose names would never appear in the headlines, but whose competence under fire held the line together. The Germans adjusted their tactics. They brought forward reserves, reinforced threatened sectors, called down artillery concentrations that turned hillsides into moonscapes of shattered rock and splintered trees. They fought with the skill of veterans who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts, and still the 92nd Infantry Division advanced. Not quickly, not without cost, but with inexorable pressure that refused to relent. They took the village of Lama di Sotto after 3 days of house-to-house fighting. They cleared German positions on Monte Folgorito, despite casualties that would have justified withdrawal. They pushed north toward Massa and Carrara, reducing strongpoints, capturing prisoners, seizing terrain that opened the coastal corridor toward Genoa. The SS officers began filing reports that contradicted previous assessments. These enemy soldiers were not poorly trained. They were not lacking in courage. They fought with coordination and discipline that made them dangerous opponents. Intelligence summaries noted the unexpected tenacity of the Schwarze Soldaten, tried to reconcile observed performance with ideological certainty, and failed. Because the men of the 92nd Infantry Division were doing something that Nazi racial theory insisted was impossible. They were winning. In the first week of February, elements of the division reached the outskirts of Carrara, an ancient city built on marble quarried since Roman times, now transformed into a fortress by German engineers who had turned centuries-old buildings into defensive positions. The city sat astride the coastal road that led north toward Genoa and ultimately Milan. Taking Carrara meant cracking open the western approach to the Po Valley. It meant demonstrating that the 92nd Infantry Division could accomplish strategic objectives, not simply hold line positions or conduct limited attacks. It meant proving, once and for all, that black soldiers could fight and win against first-line German troops in prepared defences. The battle for Carrara lasted 5 days. The 370th Infantry Regiment led the assault, advancing through marble quarries where white dust coated everything, where German snipers fired from elevated positions among the machinery and stone blocks, where every warehouse and processing building had been fortified and wired for demolition. The fighting was intimate and brutal. room to room, building to building, Americans rooting out defenders with grenades and automatic weapons fire, Germans counter-attacking to reclaim lost ground. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Americans took prisoners from SS units that had fought at Anzio and Cassino, veterans who expressed shock at the ferocity of the black soldiers they had expected to surrender at first contact. By February 10th, Carrara was in American hands. The 92nd had achieved what multiple white divisions had been unable to accomplish in the winter fighting further east. They had broken through prepared defences, seized a strategically significant city, captured hundreds of prisoners, and opened a path toward the heart of northern Italy. And they had done it under conditions where failure would have been attributed to racial limitations, but success was dismissed as luck, or attributed to the white officers nominally in command. The symbolism was lost on no one who understood the political stakes. Back in the United States, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier ran front-page stories about the 92nd's success. Civil rights leaders pointed to Carrara as evidence that segregation was a lie, that black soldiers performed as well as white soldiers when given the same training and support. The NAACP used the division's combat record to argue for integration of the armed forces. The men fighting in the mountains of Italy became symbols in a larger struggle. Their tactical victories transformed into political ammunition in the battle for racial equality at home. But in the immediate aftermath of Carrara, what mattered most was simpler and more profound. The SS had believed the men of the 92nd Infantry Division were broken before they started, incapable by nature of effective combat. And the Buffalo soldiers had marched straight through those beliefs toward Berlin, leaving behind them a trail of captured ground and shattered certainty. There was an object that followed the 92nd through those winter months, appearing again and again in letters home, in after-action reports, in the small details that soldiers noticed between firefights. It was the K-ration, that ubiquitous cardboard box containing breakfast, dinner, or supper, the compact field meal that sustained American forces from Normandy to the Pacific. Each box contained approximately 3,000 calories of processed food, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, toilet paper, and instant coffee. It was not gourmet cuisine. Soldiers complained about the monotony, the dubious quality of the canned ham and eggs, the way the crackers crumbled into dust. But what struck observers, what German prisoners remarked upon with something approaching disbelief, was the sheer abundance it represented. When SS troops were captured in the mountains above Carrara, they were often found with half-empty canteens and pockets containing only a few crusts of bread, perhaps a piece of sausage so hard it required soaking before it could be chewed. The Wehrmacht's supply situation in Italy had deteriorated to the point where frontline units went days with inadequate rations, where horses were slaughtered for meat, where forage parties risked their lives scrounging for food in abandoned villages. The German soldiers had been taught they were warriors of a superior civilization, yet they were starving in their foxholes, while the enemy they had been told was inferior ate 3 meals a day from cardboard boxes that were discarded after use. The K-ration became a symbol of something larger than mere logistics. It represented the industrial capacity of a nation that could manufacture not just tanks and aircraft, but individual meal packages for millions of soldiers deployed across the globe. It embodied a democracy that, however imperfect, however compromised by racism and inequality, could mobilize resources on a scale that the Reich, for all its vaunted efficiency, could not match. When American soldiers shared their K-rations with Italian civilians or offered them to prisoners, they were demonstrating the practical superiority of a system that fed both its fighters and its civilians, that did not require mass starvation as a precondition for military production. The Germans had built their ideology on theories of racial hierarchy, had convinced themselves that superior blood produced superior soldiers, that will and discipline could overcome material disadvantage. But ideology could not fill an empty stomach. Racial theory could not conjure supplies that did not exist. The men of the SS who watched the 92nd Infantry Division advance were confronting a truth that their entire worldview had obscured. Military effectiveness was not a function of racial purity, but of training, logistics, industrial capacity, and national will. And by every material measure, they were losing to a nation they had dismissed as degenerate. The K-ration, that humble cardboard box, testified to a truth more powerful than Goebbels' propaganda or Himmler's fantasies of blood and soil. Democracy, for all its contradictions and failures, could produce abundance. Fascism, for all its martial rhetoric and parades, produced hunger and defeat. As February turned to March, the 92nd Infantry Division continued its advance into the mountains. They fought through villages with names they could barely pronounce: Stretoya, Quecheta, Seravetsa, clearing German rearguards from positions in the Apuan Alps, pushing north along routes that would eventually converge on the Po Valley. The fighting remained hard, the casualties real, the price of each ridge and valley paid in blood. But the division had proven something that could not be taken back. They were effective combat troops. They had broken through the Gothic line. They had defeated SS units in battle. They had marched toward Berlin. The transformation in Allied command perception was gradual but undeniable. After-action reports began describing the 92nd in terms previously reserved for proven divisions. Recommendations for decorations increased. White officers who had initially viewed assignment to the division as career death began acknowledging, sometimes grudgingly, that their troops performed as well as any in theatre. The institutional skepticism did not disappear. The military remained segregated. The prejudices of a racist society did not evaporate because of battlefield success, but cracks appeared in the edifice of assumed black inferiority. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division had forced the United States Army to confront uncomfortable evidence that racial limitations existed primarily in the minds of white observers, not in the capabilities of black soldiers. For the individual soldiers who fought through that winter, the recognition mattered less than the knowledge they carried forward. They had been told they were inferior, and they had proven otherwise through the most definitive test available: combat against a determined enemy. They had carried the weight of racial representation into battle and emerged with their dignity intact and their honor earned. The psychological impact of that achievement rippled beyond the immediate tactical victories. Young men who had grown up under Jim Crow, who had been systematically denied opportunities and dignity in civilian life, had demonstrated courage and competence under conditions where no excuses were possible and no quarter given. They had looked across the battlefield at soldiers who represented the apotheosis of white supremacist ideology, and they had won. The SS defenders who survived the winter fighting in the Gothic line carried their own lessons forward. Those who were captured and processed through POW camps told interrogators that the black American soldiers fought with unexpected skill and determination. Some expressed surprise, tinged with cognitive dissonance. The reality they had experienced conflicted with everything they had been taught about race. Others rationalized, finding excuses to preserve their ideological framework. But none could deny the basic fact: they had been defeated by soldiers they had been assured were inferior. The collision between Nazi racial theory and battlefield reality produced casualties more profound than wounded bodies. It shattered certainty. By April 1945, the Gothic line was a memory. German forces in Italy were in general retreat, their defensive positions collapsing under sustained Allied pressure across the entire front. The 92nd Infantry Division drove north through Liguria, liberating towns that had lived under fascist rule for 2 decades, receiving the gratitude of Italian civilians who lined the roads and waved American flags fashioned from bedsheets and salvaged cloth. They reached Genoa on April 27th, entering the city as German forces withdrew in disorder. They were present when Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body hung upside down in a Milan square, alongside that of his mistress. They were in northern Italy when Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, when the Reich collapsed into rubble and surrender. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division did not march all the way to Berlin in literal terms. That honour belonged to Soviet forces advancing from the east and American and British armies driving through Germany from the west. But in a deeper sense, they had marched toward Berlin from the moment they stepped off the transports in Italy. They had advanced against an enemy that believed itself racially superior, and they had destroyed that belief through the most primal form of argument available: victory in battle. Every hill they took, every German position they reduced, every SS soldier they captured or killed was a refutation of Nazi ideology. They marched toward Berlin by proving that the 1,000-year Reich was built on lies. The epilogue of the 92nd Infantry Division's service in Italy was written in the months after Germany's surrender. The division remained in Italy through the summer of 1945, performing occupation duties, helping to restore order in a country devastated by years of war. Individual soldiers received decorations for valor: silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts, recognition of sacrifice and courage that had been too long delayed and too grudgingly granted. The division itself was deactivated in November 1945, its soldiers returning to a United States that remained segregated, where the victories they had won in Europe seemed to count for little in the struggle against Jim Crow at home. But history is longer than immediate disappointment. The combat record of the 92nd Infantry Division became part of the evidence that President Truman cited when he issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The valor of black soldiers in World War II provided moral authority for the civil rights movement that would transform American society in the decades that followed. The men who fought in the Gothic line carried with them a knowledge that could not be erased. They had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and they had proven their worth. That knowledge sustained them through the long struggle for equality that continued after the shooting stopped. There is a photograph from the spring of 1945, taken in a village somewhere in the mountains north of Carrara. It shows soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division resting beside a road, their rifles stacked, their helmets off, their faces showing the exhaustion of men who have been in combat for weeks. In the foreground, a young private sits on a stone wall, eating from a K-ration box, the cardboard torn open to reveal the small cans and packets inside. Behind him, the road stretches north into the distance, disappearing into forested hills where German positions still waited to be reduced. The photograph is unremarkable in most respects, just another image of soldiers at rest during a pause in operations. But it captures something essential about what the 92nd Infantry Division accomplished. The private eating his K-ration is anonymous, his name unrecorded, his individual story lost to time. But he represents all the young men who carried the burden of racial representation into combat, who fought not just against German soldiers, but against the accumulated weight of American racism and Nazi ideology simultaneously. He sits there, eating processed food from a cardboard box, and in that simple act he embodies the victory of democratic abundance over fascist scarcity, of practical competence over ideological fantasy, of human dignity over theories of racial hierarchy. The road behind him leads north toward Berlin, though he will not march all the way there. Other armies will complete that journey, will plant their flags in the ruins of Hitler's capital, will accept the formal surrender of the Reich. But this soldier and his comrades have already won the more important victory. They have proven that courage and capability are not determined by skin color, that the content of a man's character matters more than the accident of his birth, that democracy, however imperfect, contains within it the possibility of justice that fascism explicitly denies. The SS had thought the 92nd Infantry Division was broken before they started, weakened by racial inferiority, incapable of effective combat. They were marching straight toward Berlin, those SS officers had assured themselves, while the black soldiers would falter and fall away, confirming everything the Reich believed about race and war and the natural order of the world. But the Buffalo Soldiers had other plans. They marched through the Gothic line, through the Apennine Mountains, through the accumulated prejudice of two racist ideologies, and they left behind them a trail of captured ground and shattered certainty. In the end, that was the truth written in the snow of the Gothic line, testified to by the K-ration boxes littering the roadside, proven by the German prisoners who could not reconcile their defeat with their ideology. The 92nd Infantry Division had marched toward Berlin, and the 1,000-year Reich had fallen before them, not because of superior racial stock or mystic blood, but because democracy, for all its failures and contradictions, arms its defenders with something more powerful than racial theory. It arms them with the simple, revolutionary premise that all men are created equal, and it gives them the industrial might to prove it. The Buffalo Soldiers carried that premise forward into the Gothic line, and they emerged on the other side having demonstrated its truth in the only way that matters in war, through victory earned in blood and maintained through courage. They were told they were broken. They marched toward Berlin. And history, in the end, vindicated not the ideology of racial supremacy, but the stubborn courage of men who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them, who fought for a democracy that had not yet fully embraced them, who proved, through their sacrifice, that the arc of the moral universe, however long, bends toward justice. The SS learned this truth too late, in the ruins of their Reich. The men of the 92nd Infantry Division knew it from the beginning. They carried it forward through the Gothic line and beyond, a truth more durable than any defensive position, more powerful than any theory of racial hierarchy, that human worth is not determined by blood or birth, but by the content of one's character and the courage to defend what is right against those who traffic in lies. That knowledge, earned in the mountains of Italy in the winter of 1945, remains the final victory of the 92nd Infantry Division, more enduring than any tactical success, more meaningful than any decoration, more powerful than any ideological defeat inflicted on the Reich. They marched toward Berlin, those Buffalo Soldiers, and they carried with them the future.